Welcome to the Big 12, a 4-part series unraveling the history of the conference. This episode, we discuss how the Big 12 shrunk to 10 in a sweeping conference realignment across the nation.
I'm a man! I'm 40!
It's 2010, and the Big 12 would never be the same again. In February 2010, just a month after Alabama's win over Texas in the national championship, the Pac-10 was looking to expand. The Pac-10 hadn't been relevant since that mini USC dynasty from 2003 to 2005, and their star running back from that era, Reggie Bush, would be investigated and probed throughout 2009. It wasn't looking good, and USC, their bell cow, would be put on 4 years of probation starting this season. The Pac-10 needed help. Remember Texas's interest in joining the Pac-10 in the 90s? The Pac-10 actually invited Texas and Colorado, but it was after the Big 12 was formed, and we're not exactly sure what took them so long. This time though, the Pac-10 was more serious and began probing the young Big 12 conference for potential expansion. The conference wouldn't invite just Texas and Colorado though, they wanted more. The Pac-10 wanted to become the Pac-16, inviting Texas, Colorado, along with Oklahoma, Texas A&M, Texas Tech, and Oklahoma State. Out of the 6 BCS conferences, the SEC, Big 12, and ACC already had 12 teams and a conference championship, but the remaining 3 didn't. The Big East, primarily a basketball conference, was doomed and would eventually fold. The Big 10, meanwhile, at 11 members, was looking for one more to become 12. They were targeting Nebraska and Missouri from the Big 12, nearby public schools who were pretty much the best the North Division had to offer. Even rumors of the Big 10 considering Texas arose, and as usual, Texas A&M was still flirting with the SEC. But wait, why would these teams want to leave the Big 12 anyway? For teams in the South Division, they were doing just fine in the Big 12. Sure, if they were invited to form a super conference, they'd be interested, but they wouldn't leave for just any conference. Most at the time, including the Big 12, didn't have an equal distribution of TV revenue, and 3 of the top 4 dogs in the Big 12, Texas, Texas A&M, and Oklahoma, were the main ones being pursued by the Pac-10. Besides, the Texas schools weren't too excited about the travel distance. So Texas decided to negotiate. Texas wanted the Pac-10 to swap out Colorado, one of the original 2 targets, for Baylor. Texas wanted the entire Big 12 South Division to join the Pac-10, giving Texas a strong base and voting bloc in the conference. The Pac-10 was quick to strike that down. On top of that, the Pac-10 would reform their offer. Instead of a package deal for 6 teams, it would be a package deal for 5 and a standalone offer for Colorado. This is important because things weren't too happy-go-lucky in the North Division. The North was struggling on the field, and their big dog, Nebraska, was a shell of his former self, not having made a BCS Bowl since 2001. Back to the topic of equal television revenue, Nebraska, one of the 4 big dogs, didn't want the conference to adopt equal sharing either, at least at the time. In their final year with the Big 12, Nebraska would only get a $9 million payout. Maybe that made them think otherwise. And just look at the rest of the North Division, besides Kansas because of what they have to offer in basketball. The disparity may not look like much, but the Big 12 was already behind 3 other conferences in terms of revenue by 2009. The only other premier conferences the Big 12 was ahead of was the Pac-10, who was obviously in need, and the Big East, who was pretty much still here just because of basketball. Oh, and remember how I said most conferences don't have equal revenue sharing? The Big 10 was the only one who did. With 11 members at the time, that meant everyone got a $14 million payout at the time. Link to the article in the description. It wasn't just about money though. Even though the North Division was made of 6 of the original 8 Big 8 members, it didn't really feel like their conference anymore. And it technically never was, since the Big 12 was formed as a brand new conference rather than an extension of the Big 8 conference. Not only were the headquarters moved to Texas, but even the Big 12 championship game was expected to permanently move to Texas in the new Cowboys Stadium. The first year at Cowboys Stadium was actually the previous season when Texas won in a controversial finish against Nebraska, and that loss made Nebraska just 1-8 against Texas since joining the Big 12. Texas, alongside Oklahoma, was taking over the conference both on and off the field. The young conference, dominated by its southern peers, was concerning. Plus, the Big 10 and Pac-10 were academically incentivizing to join. Remember Colorado's standalone offer to the Pac-10? The Buffaloes accepted. Thanks, Texas. The Pac-10 would later add Utah and become the Pac-12. And literally the next day, Nebraska would apply to the Big 10 and they would be accepted. The Big 12 would shrink to 10 teams starting in 2011. But Texas, Texas A&M, Texas Tech, Oklahoma, and Oklahoma State still had that offer on the table to join Colorado in the Pac-10. This was before they added Utah. Missouri, the Big 10 candidate who was left out, along with 4 members of the Big 12 who were not part of the Pac-12 offer, Baylor, Kansas, Kansas State, and Iowa State, would unite together though and save the Big 12 by agreeing to restructure conference television deals to incentivize those big dogs to stay and not leave to the Pac-16. Television revenue for the Big 12 would become even more unequal as Oklahoma, Texas, and Texas A&M would be guaranteed $20 million a year if the conference were to remain intact. Texas was ecstatic. Texas Athletic Director De Los Dobbs loved the better television deal and, according to what he believed to be, an easier path to the national championship. Good luck with that one. There was something else more incentivizing for Texas in particular. The Big 12 would allow Texas to have their own television network.
You what?
At the time, the only conference with their own television network was the Big 10, but the Pac-12, SEC, and ACC would eventually follow suit. A network just for Texas? Let's just say Texas A&M wasn't too happy about this. To be fair, Texas A&M was actually offered to partner with Texas to create a joint network between the two schools. Texas A&M passed, thinking it wouldn't be profitable, and to be fair, a lot of people didn't think it would be either. Even Texas was worried about their own Longhorn Network. But Texas picked up the slack alone and landed a 20-year, $300 million deal with ESPN to create their own network, the Longhorn Network. Texas A&M tried to reopen discussions, but it was too late. They missed out, and they weren't thrilled about it. No time for that now. It's football time. One more year with Nebraska and Colorado before they officially depart. Texas football will completely crash and burn to a 5-7 record, but they still upset number 5 Nebraska on the road, funny enough, and proving to 9-1 against the Huskers in Big 12 play. Nebraska would hold on to win the North Division though, but Oklahoma would be victorious in a 23-20 comeback and give the Huskers a grand send-off in Cowboys Stadium, which I'm sure Nebraska just loved. Oklahoma also broke their BCS Bowl losing streak with a blowout 48-20 win against UConn in the Fiesta Bowl. Oh, remember TCU, the former Southwest Conference affiliate? Yeah, they became BCS busters themselves under head coach Gary Patterson. This season, TCU would go undefeated for the second straight season and rise to number 3 in the BCS rankings. Unfortunately for the Frogs, Auburn and Oregon from BCS conferences were both undefeated, so TCU didn't get a shot in the national title. TCU made the most of it though, and led by quarterback Andy Dalton, knocked off number 5 Wisconsin 21-19 in the Rose Bowl. Also, congrats to Baylor quarterback RG3, who beat out Andrew Luck for the Heisman Trophy. It's 2011, and things would only get worse for the Big 12. Due to Longhorn Network and the shaky stability of the conference, Texas A&M wanted out. After decades of flirting with the SEC, you could see where this was heading. But it wasn't just A&M who was upset. Oklahoma, who, unlike A&M, wasn't approached about the Longhorn Network, wanted out of the conference. Oklahoma pursued a potential package deal to join the Pac-12 alongside in-state rival Oklahoma State. The Pac-12, though, had just expanded and landed a new television deal the previous year, so they opted to hold out on inviting the two Oklahoma schools. For Texas A&M, though, it was over. The SEC would invite Texas A&M to join and become their 13th member. Remember how Missouri almost landed a spot in the Big Ten in place of Nebraska? Missouri had been wanting out, and the SEC wanted another member to get to 14 for easier scheduling with A&M. The SEC would invite Missouri to become their 14th member. The Big 12 was now an 8-team conference. It was officially time to panic, particularly for the big schools. Just a year after being beneficiaries of an even more unequal revenue sharing deal, the tables were turned. The big schools, like Texas and Oklahoma, had nowhere to go and would have to work together to keep the conference afloat. To stabilize the conference, the Big 12 switched gears and adopted equal television revenue sharing for all member schools. But no BCS conference, besides the Big East, ever had less than 10 members during the BCS era. The Big 12 needed to add 2 more. I hope you were paying attention to BCS buster TCU. The Big 12 quickly invited TCU to join the conference. Funny enough, TCU had already agreed to join the Big East, who was even in worse shape than the Big 12 after Syracuse and Pittsburgh left to the ACC. But TCU accepted the Big 12 invite they were looking for all along. Now the Big 12 needed one more. BYU was considered, but apparently the conference's television partners weren't excited about BYU, their no play on Sunday policy, and their own television network, BYU TV. Ironic, I know. The final candidates came down to 2 teams looking to flee the collapsing Big East, Louisville and West Virginia, and it was a neck-and-neck race. Louisville as a city had a bigger market, but West Virginia at the time had a slight edge in athletics. The Big 12 reportedly also liked West Virginia as a state flagship similar to the land-grant universities at Oklahoma State, Kansas State, and Iowa State. The winner was West Virginia. The Louisville athletic director, Tom Jurek, called this the worst day of his life, as they would be stuck in the Big East successor, the American Athletic Conference, for just one more year of suffering. Luckily for Louisville, the ACC would come knocking on their door, and I think it's safe to say Louisville isn't too upset about missing out on the Big 12 now. Both TCU and West Virginia would begin playing in the Big 12 in 2012 after Texas A&M and Missouri both left to the SEC. Without Texas A&M and Nebraska though, the Big 12 would become heavily reliant on Texas and Oklahoma. Remember how Texas felt like it was subsidizing the conference back in the Southwest Conference days alongside Texas A&M, Arkansas, and Texas Tech? Imagine how they now felt alongside Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, and Texas Tech while having to split the pot equally with all Big 12 members. Oklahoma would also carry a load off the field, but particularly on the field. So it wouldn't be too long until Texas and Oklahoma both looked elsewhere. But hey, it's football time. The final go with Texas A&M and Missouri before they depart to the SEC. The Big 12 only had 10 teams, so there were no divisions and, at least for now, no conference championship game. In 2011, it was all Oklahoma State, led by senior quarterback Brandon Weeden, junior wideout Justin Blackman, and head coach Mike Gundy. Oklahoma State navigated to a 10-0 start, the best start in school history. The Cowboys were averaging 51.7 points per game and ranked number 2 in the nation, right behind LSU, who upset Alabama on the road in an excruciating 9-6 overtime shootout. Then, the day before a road game at Iowa State, a heartbreaking tragedy occurred. 2 crew members and 8 passengers involved with the Oklahoma State basketball program passed away in a plane crash. And after the game, head coach Mike Gundy stated, "Honestly, the last thing anyone wants to do really is play a game." The Cowboys fell at 5-4 Iowa State in double overtime, but Oklahoma State would crush rival Oklahoma in the final week 44-10, while number 1 LSU stayed undefeated and won the SEC. Stanford, Pac-10 champions, also only had 1 loss, but their 53-30 home loss to Oregon, as well as their strength of schedule, kept them behind Oklahoma State at number 4 in the ranking. LSU was number 1, Stanford was number 4, but would Oklahoma State be number 2 or number 3? Enter Alabama, who had already lost to LSU and missed out on the SEC championship because of it. In Alabama's slugfest against LSU, field goals, which were the only scoring method that game, made the difference. LSU made all 3 of their attempts, while Alabama's kickers, yes, 2 kickers, combined to go just 2 of 6. There had never been a national championship game featuring two teams from the same conference, even back in the Bowl Coalition and Bold Lions times. But could it happen now? Alabama's only loss was to the number one team in the country in overtime. And not that this should be a factor in the rankings, but after Cam Newton and Auburn captured the title last year, the SEC had won all 5 of the last BCS national championships. The SEC was becoming dominant, and the pollers took notice. In the human polls, Alabama was number 2, and Oklahoma State was number 3. It wouldn't be so cut and dry though. Comparing the two resumes, Oklahoma State, believe it or not, actually had a stronger strength of schedule and twice as many wins against BCS-ranked teams than Alabama did. Because of this, the computer rankings had their pick. Oklahoma State was number 2. Oklahoma State was also conference champions, hadn't already lost to LSU, and only lost a road game in double overtime under not so great conditions. Remember how criticized a computer component was back in the early days of the BCS though? Now, the computer rankings only accounted for 1/3 of the BCS's formula, and the human polls, whether you want to call it SEC bias or not, led Alabama to edge out Oklahoma State in the BCS rankings. In the rematch between SEC rivals, Alabama will go on to prove that they were the better team than LSU, shutting them out 21-0. On the bright side, number 3 Oklahoma State and number 4 Stanford were thankfully matched against each other in the Fiesta Bowl, and it's safe to say that this shootout between quarterbacks Brandon Weeden and Andrew Luck was a lot more fun to watch than the rematch of the national championship. And Oklahoma State would be victorious 41-38 in overtime, obviously proving Brandon Weeden was better than Andrew Luck. The national championship would have irreversible consequences though. Controversy after controversy, the rematch would finally be the last straw for the BCS system. Other conferences weren't happy, acknowledging polling controversies, fan complaints, and declining viewership. Soon after the national championship, they began planning the first ever college football playoff, which would begin in 2014. But that means there's still 2 seasons with the BCS model, so let's dive into them. It's 2012, and the Big 12 was a new 10-team conference. This year, a new king rose, upsetting number 6 Oklahoma on the road early in the season 24-19. The Kansas State Wildcats took the throne. And, like Oklahoma State the year before, they started 10-0. Kansas State was still coached by the legendary Bill Snyder, and they were led by senior quarterback Colin Klein. Klein was an absolute monster on the field. He finished 3rd in Heisman voting, only behind Johnny Football, oh look, it's Texas A&M, and Manti Te'o. And in addition to those passing stats, he had 920 yards of rushing and 23 rushing touchdowns. However, like Oklahoma State, the Wildcats would crash in their 11th game. This time, it wasn't even close. They were blown out 52-24 by Baylor, the year after Heisman Trophy Robert Griffin III left to the NFL. Baylor under head coach Art Briles was just getting started though, so remember this. Kansas State would finish 11-1 as Big 12 champions, but the national championship would feature Notre Dame getting exposed as usual, this time by the one-loss SEC champions and defending national champions, Alabama. It's 2013. Once again, there was a new heir to the throne, Baylor. The private school that tagged along the Texas schools to party in the Southwest Conference was now king of the Big 12 themselves. Art Briles was an offensive mastermind, and Baylor would tear up opposing defenses under new quarterback Junior Bryce Petty. In 5 of the first 6 games, Baylor put up point totals of 69, 70, 70, 73, and 71. The next 3 games, Baylor would put up point totals of 59 and 63 in 2 games, and in the other game, blow out number 12 Oklahoma 41-12. Starting off 9-0, Baylor's offense looked unstoppable, at least until they headed into Stillwater. Unlike the Big 12 champions of the previous 2 years, Baylor would not start 10-0. Oklahoma State thrashed Baylor 49-17, the only time the Bears did not score at least 30 points. Baylor, like the previous 2 Big 12 champs though, would still finish 11-1, but they would fall to UCF, led by quarterback Blake Bortles, in the Fiesta Bowl. Florida State, led by quarterback Jameis Winston, would finally dethrone the SEC, defeating Auburn in a thrilling 34-31 comeback after trailing 21-3. The ACC was leaping over the Big 12, joining the SEC and the Big 10 in the Promised Land. The Pac-10, maybe not as much, but they had something the Big 12 didn't have: stability. Next episode, the college football playoff arrives, but despite being hailed as a great equalizer, it leaves the college football world as frustrated as before. The Big 12, once a top-tier conference in the BCS era, would seek to cement its place as a power in this new era of college football. But both on and off the field, the Young Conference would meet their demise.
Game is over.
The only lead of the night for Mike Gundy and the Cowboys is the margin of victory.